Tax. It's one of the most fundamental pillars of our modern state, but one political tribe view it as an abhorrent stain on our civilization. That's the Libertarians, of course. Fundamentally, the Libertarian believes that the individual should have the freedom to pursue their own prosperity unimpeded by the state, and to be the sole benefactor of the fruits of their own labour. The exchange of property should only be through voluntary means, rather than through the threat or actuation of violence. It is upon this basis that Libertarians will often deny the legitimacy of tax. In regards to the argument that I'm about to lay out, that under a Libertarian worldview, inheritance tax in fact should be raised, it would be foolish attempting to change the mind of those who have already shut themselves off to the idea through such a militant opposition to the whole subject. Instead, I will appeal to those with a more pragmatic mindset, and those that are open to the idea that some forms of taxation may be more justifiable than others. And if you're not a libertarian and you actually love tax, then maybe there's something in this for you as well. Now, for a more pragmatically minded libertarian, it is understood that simply clicking our fingers and abolishing tax overnight is not feasible. Rather, one can look at ways to work within the system and reform tax along libertarian lines. One thing that libertarians often do when working within a more incrementalist framework is try to reduce the size of the state and reduce the size of taxes. Now, while taking a hack and slash approach might work well in nominally moving in that direction, there is certainly a legitimate argument to be had about which areas should be focused on. For example, most libertarians would agree that reducing regulations and welfare in public services is something that should be focused on more than the military, which many libertarians view is a necessary thing to protect everyone's private property. So this should be the same for tax as well. What taxes should be focused on first? Well, in order to get to the bottom of that question, you have to step outside the simple let's reduce the state paradigm and ask yourself this instead. If we were to keep the overall level of taxation at the same level, how would we structure tax? Many libertarians that retain the idea of having some tax are often in favour of, for example, a flat tax or a land value tax. What I don't see argued for that often is inheritance tax. But consider this. Practical limitations aside, why would a flat income tax be any more justifiable than inheritance tax? After all, if we idealise a society in which an individual should earn the fruits of their own labour and not have that taken away from them, then income tax is far more egregious than inheritance tax. One's income belongs to them because it's a voluntary exchange of their own labour for wealth. Inheritance is gifted to someone, so the recipient isn't exchanging anything, it is merely bestowed upon them benevolently in a similar way to welfare. Now, I think the main objection that people will often have to this is the idea that the person that is granting the inheritance has the sole right to decide where that money goes, an argument which is based on the ideas of property rights that are fundamental to a lot of libertarian thought. But for this I have two counter-arguments. The first is that, as with most taxes, the levy is actually on the recipient, so the principles of property rights actually apply more to them than the person granting the inheritance. And as discussed before, this is an unearned form of income, so while still having property rights applied to them, there can still be a philosophical distinction between this and earned income. My second counter-argument, which I think is even more powerful, is the idea that when you are looking at it from the point of view of the person giving the inheritance, you can apply the very same principles to someone who is buying a service or an employer. An employer should have the sole right to decide what they do with their own money, and so why should that be taxed when they're giving it to their employees? And the second objection that I often get to this, which is a bit of a meme now, is this idea of double taxation. Not only is the general premise of this really flawed, because if you think about it, all money circulates around an economy and is exchanged between people, and therefore taxed many different times. From an individualist perspective, the person receiving the wealth has only just come into possession of it, so therefore this person could not have been taxed more than once for this wealth. And I fear any objection you have to that notion can just be turned around and placed on all tax, at which point we've departed from the pragmatic lens of analysis that I set out with. And in the spirit of pragmatism, it must be pointed out that libertarians over the last 30 years have had very limited success within Western governments. Whilst not wholly transformative quite yet, left-wing thought over the last few decades has become more prevalent. Therefore, it makes sense for libertarians to find issues in which there may be some overlap with those that are more politically left-leaning. An inheritance tax is one of those things. Let's say a simple policy was proposed in which income tax was lowered and then paid for by a higher inheritance tax. This is something which, for the reasons that I've just laid out, should be something that libertarians wholeheartedly support. And it's something that I think a lot of left-leaning liberal types would also support. For many on the left, they are very much concerned with things like social mobility and equality of opportunity. This kind of policy would be something that would aid in that a lot. Those with familial wealth would not have it so easy, and therefore class would be less entrenched, and those who perform well in their line of work will reap the benefits, thereby climbing the economic ladder to new heights. Merit would begin to play a larger part in where power resides within our society. And all this while sticking within a pragmatic version of libertarian principles. Therefore, to me, this is nothing but a win-win for those that are liberal-minded on the left and those that are liberal-minded on the right. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I like nothing more than getting down and dirty in my own comment section, so please, if you've got an objection, tell me why I'm wrong. And of course, if you want some more shitlib takes, consider subscribing. Have a wonderful day.
Liberaven, 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 Liberaven.